BearManor Media, in association with Audio Cinema Entertainment, presents Spotlights and Shadows, the Albert Salmi story. Written and narrated by Sandra Grabman, 2nd edition. Foreword written by Barry Newman. Foreword. Albert Salmi was not who you think he was. He wasn't who most entertainment reporters thought he was either. For the 2 years that we were working together on the television series Petrocelli, we got to know each other exceedingly well. Albert Salmi was a man in love. He simply adored his wife Roberta. He was so proud of her. When she did something hurtful, he would either forgive her or totally overlook it. We were filming 6 days a week in Arizona, 485 miles away from his family. Did he take advantage of the freedom that distance gave him? No way. He missed his wife and children, and arranged for them to stay in the hotel with him during the summer when school was out. Albert was unquestionably the sweetest, warmest, gentlest man I have ever known. He was also a giant in his field. Among the character actors who kept the entertainment industry alive, Albert was one of the best. If you were a moviegoer and television viewer any time between 1958 and 1990, you probably saw him a lot. Sometimes his characters made you angry. Sometimes they made you feel good all over. In real life, Albert Salmi could make you cry. When I received that terrible phone call telling me that he had killed Roberta, then himself, I just couldn't believe it. Today, 11 years later, I'm still in shock. Albert was not that kind of person. Now, after years of rumor and speculation, someone has cared enough about Albert to find out the truth and make it public. Now you will meet the Albert that his friends knew, and you'll understand why his death was such a shock to us. To know him is to love him. Barry Newman, 2001. Introduction.
What makes me very sad is the fact that the first thing people most often asked when they learned that I was writing Albert Salmi's biography is a variation of the same question: what really happened on April 23rd? It's as if his previous 62 years of achievement were wiped out of their minds by the events of his final day. Why is that? Maybe it's because they were having trouble accepting what they think happened. Maybe we all were. Maybe there's a good reason for that. I didn't know it at the time, but the shock and disbelief I felt when I first learned about his death was shared by Albert Salmi's friends and co-stars all over the world. Maybe he was, as often as not, the bad guy on TV, and maybe he was awfully convincing in those roles. But something deep inside told me that he was altogether different from that in real life. Murder-suicide with Albert behind the gun? What on earth could have led to such a tragic end for a man who had so much going for him? When his name came up after the tragedy, people would just shake their heads sadly. Was his life really that bad, I wondered? Didn't he experience any happiness at all? I had to find out. Albert Salmi was one of the greatest character actors our country has ever produced. Because of that, most baby boomers easily recognized his face but didn't know his name. That's because they saw him as his character, not as the actor. That's all the proof Albert needed that he was doing his job right. Throughout my adolescence in the 1960s, I had seen this man in one Western after another. He rode a horse as though he had been riding one all his life. His Old West accent seemed completely genuine to my Virginian ears. He seemed right at home hauling bales of hay and rounding up cattle. It looked so natural to see him in Western attire. Surely he must be a native of Arizona or thereabouts, I thought. Then I viewed the 1981 rebroadcast of Bang the Drum Slowly, in which Albert and several other people involved with this 1956 production were interviewed. This time he wasn't a character. He was appearing as himself, and the man was speaking with an accent that was distinctly New York. New York! After checking out biographical information about him, I discovered he was indeed born and raised in Brooklyn. That was the first of many surprises that would be revealed during the course of my research. Albert was a favorite of casting directors. From 1955 until 1990, he was in over 50 films and hundreds of television shows. Prior to that, he appeared on the live stage and continued to do so occasionally throughout his life. The three types of roles he played most frequently on screen were those of the bad guy, the authority figure, and the misunderstood good guy. Albert was perfectly suited to either extreme, the bad guy or the authority figure who arrests the bad guy. A brawny 6'2", he could be quite intimidating when the need arose, and as loud and obnoxious as necessary to get the job done. Combine that with a couple days' growth of beard, uncombed hair, and maybe a dirty shirt, and voila, there's your perfect bad guy. On the other hand, his imposing size, authoritative voice, dominating presence, and confident manner also made him the perfect authority figure. But give him the role of a misunderstood good guy, and his voice would soften, his manner become less sure. The cold, hard stare of the bad guy would be gone. In its place would be gentle humility. His walk, talk, posture, facial expression, gestures, voice, everything was now different. Somehow he no longer seemed quite as large. He was equally convincing in any role. A method actor, he was able to project a huge range of genuine emotions that set him apart from ordinary character actors. So confident professionally, he was willing to take on roles of weakness, roles in which he cried, and many in which his character died. Once he made his entrance in a wheelchair as the sweet-natured, mentally and physically disabled brother of the main character. When Albert played the victim, you could see the confused thoughts that were going through his mind. His pain was palpable. Albert Salmi could have been a major star, but he intentionally carved out his career as a less heralded character actor. In spite of that, he was given the lead a few times, and he handled these roles like the pro he was. He never allowed his ego to get in the way. He played supporting roles with just as much energy and enthusiasm as he did leading ones. His abundant energy was very much evident in one of his more offbeat characters, Alonzo P. Tucker, the pirate in 2 episodes of Lost in Space. This is a character that I didn't care for when, at age 17, I first saw him. He just didn't fit in with the macho image I expected of Albert at the time. Now, though, viewing it from a more mature perspective over 3 decades later, Alonzo P. Tucker is my very favorite of all his characters, especially in the 1966 episode entitled The Sky Pirate. This character is tender-hearted and likable, though delightfully eccentric. It was a complete departure from any other character he had done, before or since. It combined human interest and science fiction with gentle humor. With his perfect timing, he did have a flair for comedy, even though he rarely got a chance to prove it. Of course, a character actor's roles are quite diverse. I call Albert the one-man trial because he had played many of the people that one would find in a courtroom. Judges, lawyers, criminals, victims, investigators, witnesses, spectators, and janitors. After watching him go from the role of a ruthless cutthroat businessman to one of a sweet-natured paraplegic, casting directors seemed to have realized that he could do anything, and they made good use of his versatility. There seemed to be no role too challenging for him. During the course of my research, I learned that he was admired by males and females alike. While he appealed to women, he was also a man's man. He was the perfect balance of sensitivity and ruggedness. After his stunning performance in his very first film, The Brothers Karamazov, in 1958, MGM wanted to nominate him for an Oscar. Albert told them not to. Other awards were presented to him throughout his 40-year career, however. No one could say that his was not a very successful career. So what was Albert Salmi really like? Was he as successful at home as he was on the screen? Did he have a lot of friends? What did he do when the cameras weren't rolling? If he was such a good man, why did he and his wife die so violently? And what was this connection with Finland that we keep hearing about? There are many sources that state various facts about Albert and his work. Many of them are contradictory. Some hold him up as a saint, others as a monster. Which of these facts are real and which are just rumor? In researching Albert's life and talking with some of the people who meant the most to him, I have learned many surprising facts and have grown to respect the man even more, not only as a very gifted actor, but as a human being as well. There was both triumph and tragedy in his life. Let's travel the road together to see what led up to the worst tragedy of all, the gunshots that shocked the world.
Sandra Grabman, 2001. The biography of Albert Salmi. Albert Salmi's own recollections, performed here by Michael Hochter, are taken from his unfinished, handwritten memoirs, written in 1990, and beginning with the words,
"This little book is of my experiences in theater and films, which encompasses some 40 years.
Even though the author has taken the liberty of polishing up his first draft writing a bit, the essence is entirely Salmi's. In addition to telling us about his career, these memoirs give us a rare glimpse of the mischievous little boy who grew up to become the ultimate character actor of his time. These are the happenings of his life, as Salmi remembered them, from childhood until about 1970. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to finish this project. Chapter 1. From Albert Salmi as George Breckworth in the film Sweet Creek County War.
The sheriff said decent folk respect decent ways.
In 1928, a postage stamp cost 2 cents. Amelia Earhart made headlines as the first woman passenger to fly across the Atlantic. Penicillin was newly discovered, and Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States. Meanwhile, a Finnish couple was making news of their own in Brooklyn, New York. Svante and Ida Salmi had just become the proud parents of their first and only child, born on Sunday, March 11th at Coney Island Hospital. Later in life, he would be known throughout the world as Albert, but on this day they named him Alfred. Little Alfred was in good company. Shirley Temple was born that year, as were Roddy McDowell, Fred Rogers, and James Garner. Mickey Mouse in the classic Steamboat Willie sprang to life in his first talkie, and the development of television was in its infancy. Both of Alfred's parents had fled the Civil War in Finland. The only world they had known, that of the Russian Empire, was now collapsing, so they came to America to seek a better life. The youngest of 8 children, Ida Josephina Friedman, had been born and raised in Tampere, Finland. She had been a weaver there before immigrating to America to join her sisters Hilma, nicknamed Sani, and Maria, nicknamed Ali, in 1920. Svante Salmi, formerly a lumberjack in Finland and now a carpenter, had come into America illegally through Canada in the 1920s. The couple married and settled in Brooklyn in 1924. Once Social Security legislation was passed, a change in jobs would become routine whenever Svante's employer asked to see a Social Security card. He eventually obtained one, and his family enjoyed more stability. The Salmis lived in an apartment building on 41st Street in the Finnish Quarter in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn, and Finnish was their everyday language. The stoic, hard-working Finnish culture in which he was raised would have a powerful effect on Alfred throughout his life. Svante was often away, going wherever his logging and carpentry services were needed. Ida's sister Sanny Sandstrom and her family, who lived in the same apartment building as the Salmis did, were good company for Alfred and his mother while his father was away. Sonny's daughter Helen was 9 years older than her cousin. Little Alfred had never seen his grandparents. They and most of his aunts, uncles, and cousins were still in faraway Finland. Later, he would yearn to see for himself his parents' homeland and get to know the relatives about whom he had heard so much throughout his childhood. It became necessary for Ida to supplement the family income by working as a domestic housekeeper. Someone needed to take care of her 2-year-old son while she was working, so she enlisted the help of Sonny's in-laws, Impy and Henry Sandstrom in Babylon, New York. The Sandstroms, like Ida, were from Tampere, Finland, and she felt a bond with them. They took young Alfred in as a boarder during the summer. In this family, he no longer felt like an only child, for there were now 3 brothers, Arnold, age 10, Raymond, 5, and Roy, 4. Would a 2-year-old child understand that this was only a temporary arrangement born of necessity, that he was not being abandoned by his mother? It was only for a few months, however, and then he was back in Ida's arms. At age 4, the need for long-term care again arose. This time another branch of the Sandstrom family, Henry's brother Väinö and his wife Adolfina, lovingly cared for Alfred at their home in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Their children were much older than he. Carlo was 21 and Urja Helen was 17, so Alfred found playmates in their neighborhood. It was there that he learned what would later be described as fresh words that he would use occasionally in the Sandstrom home. Most of the time, though, he behaved himself. Even though Finnish was his primary language, Alfred couldn't quite pronounce its K sounds, so would substitute them with T's. The Sandstroms thought it was so cute when he would ask for one of his favorite foods, hot dogs. In Finnish, 2 hot dogs are pronounced kaksi makara. In Alfredese, however, it came out tatsi matara. After 6 weeks, he returned home to his parents. Here, in his own words, is what his world was like back then.
I'm from Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn was a simple place in my youth. The streets on which we lived had quite an incline, and in those days apartment buildings were heated by hot water radiators and the furnace burned coal. Coal ash was put out every week in garbage cans. In the winters, with snow on the ground, we took the coal ash, put them on sleds, and spread them at the bottom of the street. We did this to stop the sleds from going onto Fifth Avenue, a well-traveled street that also had trolley cars. The hill that we sledded on was between 5th and 6th Avenue on 41st Street, and every winter many sledders were injured or killed by automobiles or trolley cars. The object for some of us was to get through the coal ash, safely cross 5th Avenue, and then continue down to 4th Avenue. Ho, ho, ho! To succeed was thrilling. Now, understand this. Adults had nothing to do with spreading the ash, and they made no attempt to control our dangerous endeavors. Maybe that's the best way. They let us make our own mistakes without interference. We knew the dangers, we accepted them, we tried to avoid them. Oh, can you imagine what social services would do to parents today if this practice were still pursued?
Parents of that time and place were much less protective of their children than they are now. But that is not to say that Alfred's parents were neglectful. Svante especially was of the old school and was quite hard on his son. As was common back then, he ruled his family with an iron hand. Many years later, when talking to a friend about his father, Alfred described him as a big burly man who hung around taverns and got in fights. Albert told the Sun of St. Paul, Minnesota,
Well, he was known to carry a knife. The Finns have a saying that means, I can take it all, meaning the knife. My father was that kind of a man.
Alfred's relationship to his mother, however, was more affectionate. From her he learned tenderness. Money was scarce for the Salmi family, as it was for their neighbors in the Great Depression. Still, Alfred and his buddies had devised ways to enjoy various forms of entertainment without the benefit of money.
The trolley cars mentioned earlier were also our mode of transportation, as we would jump on the back of them and ride as far as we wanted. When we desired to get off, we would simply pull a line that disengaged the electrical connection from the overhead line. The trolley car would stop, we would take off running. We were not the favorites of the trolley car operator because every time he would have to come to the back of the trolley, replace the connection so the trolley could proceed. In those days, we could travel all over Brooklyn by trolley, even out to Coney Island, which in the summertime we did a great deal.
I remember the kids that hung onto the backs of the trolleys and buses to hitch a ride, says Larry Simmons, who was 2 years behind Alfred in their school. Many of us did travel in groups that today would be frowned upon. You have to remember that things were a lot different then and a lot tougher.
Well, it was a simpler life. Early in January, Christmas trees were put out by the garbage. The streets had 4-story apartment buildings from 4th Avenue to 17th Avenue, so you can imagine how many trees there were. We would collect the trees until we felt we had enough. A large pile of Christmas trees. Can you imagine the temptation? Why do youngsters love to set a fire? On 41st Street, there was a park, a small park, just across the street. Its boundaries were on 41st Street from 5th to 7th, and from 41st to, I think it was 40, between Park and Slope, anyway, on Bay Ridge. It was named Sunset Park. There was a 6-foot stone wall encircling the park with entrances at every corner. At any rate, we gathered these Christmas trees, put them into a large pile, and set fire to them. Talk about tradition. We did this every year for years and years, and no police or city officials ever interfered. Sunset Park also had a swimming pool. We never paid to enter. We preferred to climb a fence with a bathing suit and a towel. We never paid for going to the movies. Always climbing in the window of the men's room in the back, or slipping in a side door when someone else was exiting.
In Finland, families would go to halls for companionship and entertainment, and the Salmis found such a place in New York. Ida and her son would frequently take the subway to the Fifth Avenue Hall in Harlem. One of the prime sources of entertainment there was stage plays, as fans had a high respect for good acting. Of those few children's roles that had speaking parts, most went to young Alfred Salmi, his talent already recognized.
From 6th to 10th Avenues was the Finnish ghetto. I'm a Finn. I grew up there. In fact, when I first entered the public school system, I could speak very little English. I was told, go home and learn English, and then, and only then, return for my education. There were no bilingual teachers in those days. I did it in short order and began my education, such as it was.
Where did he learn English? On the streets, answers his youngest daughter, Jenny. That method seems to have worked well.